and welcome to the Art of Being Human. I thought this morning I'd take a few minutes and talk to you about infections because diabetics are really prone to them. It's easy to get infections and it's very hard to get rid of them. And I know that one of the things that caused people to wonder about whether I was diabetic or not was the fact I was always getting foot infections. So it's important to have a handle on infections and what you do about them. And I know what most people do. They soak, if it's a hand infection or a foot infection, they soak it in either hydrogen peroxide or Epsom salts. So most people get infections. If they're going to get them and they're diabetic, they're going to get them in their feet or they're going to get them in their hands. I remember being up in this area. I hadn't moved in this area, but I was up in the area and I was scheduled to do some meetings. And I went to bed the night before. I had come a day early, and I was fine when I went to bed. You know, I felt fine. Everything was fine. When I woke up the next morning, one of my big toes was just really huge. It had grown like 2 or 3 times its normal size because of an infection that it had. Now, I don't know where I got the infection from. It didn't hurt, but I knew I had to have immediate attention, so I ended up in the emergency room of the hospital. And the doctor came in and said, "Oh my gosh, look at your toe, that's terrible. It must hurt awful." It didn't hurt at all, but it was so huge I could barely get my foot in the shoe. So it turned out I had a bacterial infection. Where did it come from? I have no idea. I was fine when I went to bed, and that was just overnight. If you have an infection and you're a diabetic, it can just balloon all over the place. It can just be very, very pronounced in a very short period of time. I know with a foot infection, I can go to the doctor in one day. "Oh, it's not infected, you'll be fine." Overnight it's infected and I have a bad infection. That's the way it is when you're a diabetic. In another instance, I looked at my toe and it had a hole in it. I don't know where it came from. I didn't stub my toe. I didn't drive a nail in my foot or anything like that, but that's what it looked like I did. It looked like somebody put a nail right in my foot. And I could actually take and put drops of liquid in it and have it go in the hole. Well, I kind of blew it off. It wasn't infected. And then suddenly it dawned on me that this is stupid. I'm a diabetic with a hole in my foot. It needs attention. So I ended up in the emergency room. And of course, it was the antibiotics and wrapping it up and medications and all of that kind of stuff. So it's very easy if you're a diabetic to get an infection. It's harder to get rid of it. And most people will use either hydrogen peroxide, which I have here, or Epsom salts. I want to talk about these two things. Also, they use hot water and salt. Now, I want to talk first about hydrogen peroxide. Most of us have it in our homes, and most of us soak our feet with it. And most of us will have some success in controlling infections that way. But it's interesting about hydrogen peroxide. I had a foot infection. I soaked it with hydrogen peroxide, which is what everybody does. You put some in a pan of water and the infection goes away. Well, the problem is it wasn't working. So I ended up in the emergency room of the hospital, and this is what the doctor told me that I thought was most interesting that you might not be aware of. The composition, the chemical formula for hydrogen peroxide is H2O2. That's very close to water. Water is H2O, and just add that extra 2, H2O2, and you have hydrogen peroxide. So there's not much difference. The other thing that he told me was once you put it on, you know when you put it on, it bubbles up. It kind of fizzes, and then the fizz goes away. And then what he told me that as soon as it fizzes and the air hits it, it becomes regular water again. It's just H2O, nothing more than that. So you have that brief period of time when it fizzes up for usually less than a minute. I mean, the fizz goes down quite rapidly, and then what have you got? Water. That's all, H2O. It changes back to water as soon as the air hits it. And the air is going to hit it as soon as you put it on. So I'm wondering how much effect it has after that. So some people soak their feet, and they soak their feet for 20 minutes to a half an hour at night. If they have an infection, they pour in the hydrogen peroxide, and then they are really only soaking their feet in water after the first minute or two because it changes back to water. So how much help is it? Well, it is advertised as a disinfectant, and so therefore it probably does have a disinfectant effect. When it goes back to water, that's all it is, it's water. So you're soaking your feet in some extra water that you put in. Although the doctor did tell me that you wouldn't want to drink it. Even though it's H2O, you would not want to drink it as H2O. But at any rate, that's hydrogen peroxide, and it does debriding work. In other words, it removes dead tissue from wounds and things like that. It is advertised as a disinfectant. Now, the other things I wanted to talk to you about is Epsom salts. A lot of people use Epsom salts, and they use it as an antiseptic. Now, a friend of mine who's a police officer said that she used it a lot as an antiseptic. She says you put your feet in a pan of water and you add the Epsom salts, and it draws infection away from you. And she says, I use it every time I have a foot infection, and it works like a charm. It just draws the infection away. And I looked at it, and there's absolutely nothing on this box where it was. This is just an empty box. There's nothing on the box that says that you can use it as some kind of a disinfectant. It talks a lot about using like 2 cups of it, and you put it in warm water, and you can soothe aching feet. You can relax with it, you know, and it acts as a relaxant to your feet. It soothes the feet if they're tired or if they're achy, but nothing about a disinfectant. In fact, there's a warning against using it for that. So I want to read this warning right from the box. For external use only, do not ingest. And by the way, I have heard of people drinking it, mixing it with water and drinking it because they think it flushes out their system and it has a certain laxative effect, and supposedly it was safe for that. But this box says no, don't ever you do that. For external use only, do not ingest. Where prompt relief is not obtained or where there is evidence of infection, discontinue use and consult physician. In other words, if you have an infection, don't use it. That's what it says right on the box. And then it continues, hot or warm soaks should not be used by individuals with diabetes, except on advice of a physician. Avoid eye contact. And that's what I want to get into next. Hot and warm soaks should not be used by individuals with diabetes. Now, a doctor told me, he said, don't ever soak your feet in hot water if you have an infection and you're diabetic. Don't ever do it. This is what a doctor told me. And the reason for that is that hot water opens pores. And when you open the pores, it allows the infection to go in deeper. And this is what a former podiatrist that I had told me. He says, Pat, never soak your feet in hot water. If you have an infection, it just opens the pores. The heat opens the pores, and it allows the infection to go deeper into your system. The one thing that you don't want to do if you're diabetic is get an infection that's deeper or worse. It's harder to handle. It's harder to get healed from. So if you do have a problem with infection, don't use Epsom salts. That's what it says right on the box. If you have an infection, stop using it and consult with your doctor. And if you are diabetic, don't have hot water or warm soaks if you're diabetic. Now, it doesn't explain the reason for that, but I would say that Epsom salts is probably something that you might want to consider staying away from if you have an infection, and having a hot water soak with Epsom salts in it is something you want to stay away from. That's my take on it based upon what's on this box and what a doctor has told me. Now, I also have to add, though, this is lavender flavored. There's a fragrance to it. And it is a lavender fragrance, which means it has extra chemicals in it in order to get the fragrance. And maybe that makes a difference as to what you can use it for. You can get Epsom salts that doesn't have any kind of a fragrance. Maybe that makes a difference. But just on the basis of what's on this box, it can't be used for infections, and it can't be used, and it's not recommended for hot water soaks. So I wanted to just go over that with you. And the other thing I wanted to mention before I get into anything else is salt. A lot of people use salt for infection control and to reduce infection and heal it, and salt will do that. You have to be careful of salt. And what you have to be careful of is salt is very, very caustic. And if you get too much salt, you can get a bad burn from it. I know I was talking with a friend of mine who's a dental assistant, and it had been recommended that I use a saltwater rinse for an infection in my mouth. And she says, Pat, if you do that, be so careful. Only use a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of salt, and with plenty of water. Don't use a lot of salt. Some people pour the salt in figuring the more salt the better, and then they add the hot water and they rinse their mouth and they hold it in there. You can get a bad burn from salt because it's so caustic. She recommended only 1/8 of a teaspoon or 1/2 a teaspoon to a full glass of warm water, and not holding it in your mouth very long. I remember when I was a teenager, I had an infection in my mouth, and I went to a dentist who recommended that I use both hydrogen peroxide and use a saltwater rinse. Now, I did get rid of the infection. Without that, he would have had to have operated on my gums, and both of them in combination took care of it. I don't know how I got it, but there was a white line of pus like all the way around by my gum, and so I knew it was infected. But with the combination of what he told me to do, I got rid of it. But I'm wondering if, was it one thing? Was it the other thing? Was there a combination of things? But you need to be careful if you have an infection. It is a problem. Consider it to be a problem if you have an infection, because your body doesn't know what to do with it. If you have an infection, or if you have a cold, or if you have a flu or something like that, what's going to happen is their body does not know what to do. And your blood sugar is going to go sky high because your body is under stress. Any kind of an infection or an injury puts your body in stress. And when your body is in stress, the liver is going to pump in more and more sugar in your system. But it doesn't know how to shut down. The pancreas would shut it down if you had a healthy pancreas, but if you're diabetic, you don't have a healthy pancreas, so it just keeps pumping and pumping and pumping sugar into your system, and your blood sugar gets very high. And of course, it makes it harder to get rid of an infection, because what does germs or what the bacteria like? They like to have sweet, soft, warm places, and they have it in blood systems that have too much sugar in it. And as a diabetic, you have too much glucose. So it gets to be complicated. My advice is, if you are having an infection, go see a doctor, call a doctor, do not wait. I think in the local hospitals they have a rule. Somebody told me about it, and I think it's true. If you call to the office of a doctor, or if you call to the office of the hospital and you say, I've got a foot infection, or I'm diabetic and I have a foot infection, and what should I do? They are obligated to see you that day. They do not put it off. And they always have extra spaces where they will squeeze you in an emergency, because once an infection gets rooted in your system, it's very, very, very difficult to get rid of it. And usually we fool around with it. Oh, I think it'll be all right. Let's give it a couple of days. But if you're diabetic, you can't give it a couple days, because a couple of days gives it an awful lot of chance to make too much progress, and it's harder to fight down. It's harder to kill the infection. And as you grow older and the diabetes progresses, you're going to find it's much more difficult to get rid of an infection than you thought. The healing time is slowed down. If you're diabetic, you are prone to infections. If you're diabetic, the process of healing is slower. It is harder to heal. Now, even as a diabetic, I've always healed very well and fairly quickly, but I have noticed within the last year that my healing time has slowed down, and it's not so fast and it's not so quick. And so what we tend to do is forget about it. It'll be all right. I'll soak it tonight. I'll put antibiotic ointment on it, and therefore it'll be okay. I had a foot doctor that said if you're going to buy ointment, like an antibiotic kind of ointment, which as a diabetic you really need to have on hand at all times, it's better for you to buy one that has several ingredients than to buy one that has one ingredient. Because if you have just one ingredient in it or one or two ingredients in it, it's easier to become allergic to. And once you become allergic to it, you can't use it. You know, I think of the people who drink soy milk instead of regular milk because they think it's healthier, and that's okay. I have no objection to that. But what a person told me, a naturopathist told me about soy, it's easy to become allergic to. There is soy in a lot of food items, and the one thing you really don't want to do is to become allergic to soy, because if you become allergic to soy, you not only can't drink soy milk, but you can't eat any of the foods that soy is in, because you're going to be allergic to all of them. So if you drink soy, be very careful and don't get so much that your body wants to become allergic to it, because then you can't eat it and you can't drink it and you can't eat any of the foods it is in. And my doctor was saying, get an antibiotic with the most ingredients in it, and then there'll be less chance that you're going to become allergic to any one of the ingredients, and that will help you. Now, I was going to start something else this segment, but I don't think I will, because I don't have a time to get into it, and our time will run out. So I'm going to close it here, and next time I'm going to look at insulin. How was it that we started to use it? What's the history of insulin anyway? How did we find out that insulin was a thing to use if you're diabetic? So we'll start on that next time, and we still have more things to do in terms of diabetes. Before we close off this section, I want to talk about stomach neuropathy, and there are some other things to talk about as well. So we'll be here for a while with that, but it won't be too much longer, and we'll start closing off and then doing something else, another kind of segment. So I'll close it here. Please join me next time.